Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold. And if I asked a question like, what is God's relationship to creation? You might think, well, that's kind of a silly question because the answer would be everything. And it is everything. But we're going to talk about that today with Ken Samples. He's a philosopher and theologian at Reasons to Believe. You can learn more about him at reasons.org. He is an author. He has written several books, including Christianity Cross-Examined, Classic Christian Thinkers, and God Among Sages. I love this topic. Ken, welcome and congratulations to your Dodgers on winning the World Series.
Well, Bill, it's good to talk to you, and I'm a happy Dodger fan.
And I knew Wyatt and I were just so excited to talk to you about that.
Well, if they would have lost.
Relationship to creation. I know Christian theologians through the centuries have brought up this phrase, ex nihilo, creation out of or from nothing. I hope I did my Latin okay.
You did, yeah. The full expression is creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing.
Okay.
And it's a very important term because it means that only God existed, only the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and he calls all other things, both material and spiritual, into existence out of nothing. So everything other than God is dependent, contingent, is finite. And so God brings everything out of existence from purely nothing. And so it is his incredible power, his incredible intelligence that brings this all into existence. And nothing competes with God's eternal sovereignty. The way I like to teach it is I put a line on the whiteboard. I say on top of the line is God. Everything else is below the line, the creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So God is the creator of all things from nothing.
And he created all of this with the power of his word.
That's exactly right. Yes. Very, very important in Scripture. And we see this even in Genesis 1-2. That the Father is the creator, but the Son, his eternal word, and his Spirit. In Genesis 1-2, it talks about the Spirit hovering over the creation. So the Father's the primary agent in creation, but the Son and the Spirit are his co-agents. They kind of pretty it up. They beautify it, if you will.
Ken, let's talk about this word nihilo, or nothing. What is meant by that?
Yeah, it is a very critical term because Plato, the great Greek philosopher who lived about 450 years before the birth of Christ, Plato believed in a god called the demiurge, and the demiurge kind of created the world out of pre-existent matter. Well, the early Christians, they wanted to differentiate themselves from Greek philosophy, and they said, no, God doesn't create out of some substances that are hanging around. He creates out of or totally from nothing. So he doesn't create through the universe is not his body. He doesn't create that way. What he creates, it comes into existence out of nothing. And what's interesting, Bill, working with scientists at Reasons to Believe, a lot of secular scientists, when they say that the universe came into existence, they will say it came from nothing, but they don't really mean nothing. They mean some kind of quantum reality. The biblical and Christian theological idea is there was nothing in existence but God, and God brought or spoke, created all things from no thing. That's the very meaning of it. No thing, nothing.
When I read Genesis chapter 1, though, Ken, and I see that the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, I still have some image of some substance of some kind, but I shouldn't, should I?
Well, there was nothing before, but I think what you can and should think is that God had this initial creation and it was kind of forming. That's where we bring in the eternal word and the spirit, and they kind of bring it into completion. And so again, whenever a member of the Trinity is involved in a task, all three of them are. So the Father is said to be the creator, but then the Son and the Spirit, they bring it into existence where you can have life, where you can have beauty, and all of these kinds of things.
Because when the verse finishes and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, I think, well, waters is not nothing.
Yeah, that's right. But remember that it's already in existence. It's an instantaneous creation. It's not when it talks about waters, something has already existed. The creation has already begun.
Okay, that's helpful.
But the Spirit and the Father then are working on it.
Ken Samples is my guest, and as we talk about God's relationship to creation, which is a fascinating topic, and I will need Ken's help this hour because he knows way more than I do. And if you have a question or comment for Ken, let me know what it is, 877-933-2484. Now, this creation of out of nothing, let's, Ken, talk about maybe the critical implications of this, the creation out of or from nothing.
Yeah, and what's really important here is now we're going to compare it with what other religions say. You know, in Hinduism, they say that the universe is God's body. Well, Jews didn't believe that. Christians didn't believe that. In fact, it's critical, even for the emergence of science in the 1600s, for the universe to be a place that we can investigate, we could poke, we could discover. Hinduism says that the universe is God's body. So we don't want to say that the cosmos was created either in God or out of God's body. That's not a Judeo-Christian, that's not a biblical perspective. But nor do we want to say, as I said before, and here we're speaking about Plato, nor do we want to say that God somehow had some pre-existent matter and he created it out of this existing world. And the problem there is, if there was something prior to God, then God would not be the eternal sovereign one. Again, that line on the whiteboard, only God is above the line, the creator. Everything else is below the line, the creation. And then thirdly, we don't want to say that the cosmos came out of nothing, that was an actual something. And again, this is sometimes misunderstood. We're not saying that the universe came into existence without the mind of God. No, God's mind, his power, his intelligence, his beauty brought everything into existence from non-existence. And again, that places God in a completely different category than us. And Bill, you know, when I go through difficulties in life, I like to think about God. I like to think about that power. I like to think about the fact that nothing is too difficult for God. And so these ideas have real implications. We don't hold a Hindu view. We don't hold a Platonic view. But we also recognize that God is our Father and that he is the creator of all things. And if he can create everything out of nothing, he can meet our needs. He can fulfill the promises that he has made to us through his son, Jesus Christ.
Ken, you know, I think one of the reasons I probably struggle with this a little bit, it's difficult for me to comprehend that you can, because, you know, we need materials from which to build something. He's not constrained. He doesn't have to rely on the law of physics for anything. I mean, he does what
That,
he
that's
wants, how he wants, when he wants.
that's right on target. God is able to bring things into existence that didn't previously exist. Whereas with us, we got to have something to
Yeah.
work with. I mean, think of artificial intelligence. Think of all that went into that, computers, intelligent people around the globe, all working together to bring about artificial intelligence. And even artificial intelligence cannot really think the way we do, and certainly not the way God does. But God is the great engineer, He's the great inventor. But all of that goes beyond any categories we have.
Yeah, we do. Humans are obviously very creative, but we need something to work with. I mean, we can convert, matter from solid to liquid, but we can't create matter from nothing.
Yes, and that again, that puts God in a different category of being than us, where existence, being, and so here's another way of thinking of it. Only the triune God. So what is nothing? No matter, no energy, no time, no space, no potential, no actual, no reason, no logic. Simply God brings all this into existence. And that's why when the universe was viewed as having a beginning right about the 1960s, that's when scientists began to say the universe seems to have had a beginning. That's what rocked a lot of the secular scientists. They thought, oh my goodness, if there's no matter, energy, space, and time, then we're forced to deal with some kind of religious explanation. And so that's of course what the Bible indicates, that God is the creator of the world.
Hmm.
And it's such an important doctrine to think about. And it should lead us, as we'll talk about later, it should lead us to worship the Lord, to thank him, to be grateful, because that food we're going to enjoy here in a few weeks on Thanksgiving morning, everything comes from God.
So, Ken, if we think of biogenesis, and that is we have life from life, that is not that's different from creation ex nihilo, isn't it? Because right, we're getting life from nothing.
That's right. And even if you think about Genesis 2:1, I'm sorry, 2:7, where God takes the dust of the ground, breathes into it the breath of life, and man becomes a living being. Animals and humans are created from the dust of the ground. Humans get the breath of life. But prior to that, there was nothing at all other than God. There was no eternal dirt. There was no eternal energy or power. And so this doctrine, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, the book of Genesis, this is very different than what you find in Egyptian religion, you find in the religions of India and various other places. And so the creation perspective, 6-day creation, this is this is really an apologetic to all of these other worldviews that are trying to make sense of reality.
Ken, when I think of this supernatural event of God creating things out of nothing, uh, God produces things that never existed in any form or in any way. It is such an incredible, spectacular thought.
And even that Latin word, supernatural, supra meaning above, that God brings things into existence. He stands above and beyond all of this. And therefore, when we have our lives, everything comes from him. Everything ultimately comes from God. We owe him. We are obligated to him. We have in him we live and move and have our being. And therefore, when we rebel against God, uh, God has a right to hold us accountable because he brought us into existence from nothing.
Ken, does Genesis chapter 1, do you believe it to be a literal 24-hour day?
Well, I do not, but that needs a little unpacking a little bit there.
Okay.
I believe that these creation days are analogous to the work days of human beings. So you have this in scripture, you have this 6 in 1, 6 work days and then a day of rest. I believe that this is an analogy to what God has done. And so I hold an analogical day. There are other Christians who hold 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. There are other Christians who say, no, these are not specific days, they're ages. So there have been many interpretations. I hold what would be called an analogical day viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't we look at Genesis 1, though, and see the evening and the morning to suggest that the author meant a 24-hour period?
Well, what's interesting is that a day was actually measured from evening to evening, sundown, like the Sabbath,
Okay.
sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. Evening and morning changes that whole idea. That's a new phraseology. And even if you look at the 6 days, some of my friends who hold a calendar day view, a 6 24-hour periods, they would say that first you have Earth rotation days, 1 through 3. Then you have solar days because there's a sun and a moon. And then the seventh day is a very long period. So I come back to that and I say, that sounds like 3 different kinds of days. Again, I think what's so important is Christians take differing viewpoints, but these are very different than the philosophical systems of the world and religions that deny all of that. So yeah, Christians have some disagreement, but they're minor compared to the differences we have with other worldviews.
All right, we will take a break and come back. Ken Samples is my guest, and we are talking about God and creation. If you have a question or comment for Ken, let me know, 877-933-2484. Hi, podcast listener. You know, I'm Bill Arnold, and my theme song says, "What's for dinner?" And like when I'm grilling, I'm paying really close attention. And I know that ideal second to get the food off the grill. Like all good and ideal timings in life, right now would be an ideal time to be a cheerful giver to Faith Radio. Give now to support this podcast so that more people in more places might come to saving faith in Jesus and grow in their relationship and become a fully devoted follower. Click the link in the show notes or give now at myfaithradio.com. Welcome to the show. If you just climbed in your car, I hope you had a good day at work or whatever you had going on today. I'm talking to Ken Samples about God and creation and God's relationship to creation. I love your visual, Ken, of the whiteboard with the line and God on top and everything else below it. That's sticking out with me. But I was also thinking during the break about, did God not create like a 6-day model for how we go about our week with 6 work days and 1 rest day?
Oh, yeah, that's such an important component. So we're seeing kind of here, and again, we're seeing what I would call God's work day, and the human work week models after God's work week. And so the 6 in 1 is a critical distinction. There's nothing like that in any of the other, Egyptian religions, Indian religion, or Chinese religions.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, Genesis really was an apologetic text. It was declaring that the Jews believed in a different kind of God than any other, and a very different view of creation.
Mm-hmm. So creation ex nihilo, creation out of or from nothing. Let's talk about the biblical support for this doctrine, Ken.
Yeah, we've got to have a biblical basis.
Yes, we do.
I'm going to give you 4 verses. There are others we could bring to it, but I think these are probably the most important. Genesis 1:1, the very first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that expression, heavens and earth in Hebrew, means the totality of all things. And so here we have, I think, a creation ex nihilo verse. In the beginning, God created the totality of all things, not just the heavens above and earth as a planet, but this Hebrew expression is everything, the totality of everything. So again, God on top of the line, everything else below the line. Here Romans, moving to the New Testament, Romans 4:17, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. A God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Creation ex nihilo. God creates not from pre-existent matter, brings things into existence that have never existed at all. Colossians 1:16, for in him all things, this is speaking about Christ, the Son, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So there is another world, that spiritual world. We know there are angelic beings. God's creation is more than just matter, energy, time, and space. It involves a spiritual reality. And then Hebrews 11:3, Bill, for by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. What was seen was not made out of what was visible. So the idea here is, again, that what we see now at one point did not exist at all. And so creation ex nihilo, I think those are four of the most specific verses. And I think other passages then fall into line.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here in absolute deeper awe and wonder of God and his methodology of creation and creating everything out of nothing. It's mind-blowing.
And if you think about what we have the James Webb Space Telescope, which is a big improvement on other telescopes. There are now astrophysicists who say there may be 1 trillion or possibly 2 trillion different galaxies. Now, when I go outside at night and look up in the sky, it looks pretty big to me. But the idea that we live in one galaxy in light of all of this creation, again, I like to think about these things, Bill, because there are times in life I go through a tough time. And these things encourage me. If this is the God that I believe in, if he can bring into existence something that did not exist, then he can give life to me when I get around to dying. So this is a supernatural worldview. This is a God that is the creator and redeemer of all humanity. And it's very important to see God in very big terms. That's what leads us to have confidence. It leads us to devotion. We're supposed to worship the Lord. According to the book of Exodus, we're supposed to worship the Lord. And in a Christian context, we do that week by week, but we should do it every day. But this really tells us that our God is beyond any comparison. And sometimes I kind of chuckle because in the Old Testament, it says God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, I'm sure to shepherds at the time, that just seemed enormous. But now, in light of maybe 1 trillion galaxies, wow.
Yeah, it's just stunning.
Yeah.
All right, Ken, I know there's probably some broader points. These are ones I want to sort of have you discuss with us, maybe broader points in God's relationship to creation.
Yeah, these are again very important. The first one, I just want to underscore something we said before, that Christians believe that God is a Trinity, so he's one God in three persons. And I think when we pour through Scripture, we see that the Father is the primary agent of creation. But remember, the Son and the Spirit are equal to the Father. They share that one divine essence equally and fully. And so the Son and the Spirit are co-agents in creation. And again, I think we see the Trinity in the first couple verses. You have the Father creating, he creates through the Son, and you have the Holy Spirit sustaining it. So it's the triune God that creates all things. A second point, and I think it's again, all we're doing is kind of summarizing the point we made earlier, that all things come out of or from nothing. No pre-existent material. As you mentioned, human beings, engineers, designers, we have to have something to work with. God creates the very foundation. And so in the book of Acts, in him we live and move and have our being. This is a very different view of God. This changes our entire perspective because, again, he owns everything. And if God were to remove his providential hand, now God is a spiritual being, I'm using a metaphor of a hand, but if God were to remove his providential hand, the entire universe, the entire creation, including Lucifer and the fallen angels, would tumble into non-existence. So the devil is a very powerful being, and I don't in any way want to miss the power, deception, and the evil of the evil one. But compared to God, Lucifer must be very deceived because he knows something about God. A third implication, Bill, would be that really it's creation's a double miracle. Not only does the triune God bring something into existence out of nothing, but if God didn't sustain it, it would tumble back into non-existence. God has not only created all things, but he holds them, he preserves them in existence. And so we have this double miracle. We have God's creation and providence that are theologically very close together. So again, if God were to stop sustaining the universe and all of creation, it would no longer exist. What kind of being is this? This is what Christians really mean by God. This is the biblical perspective. And then finally, a fourth implication is not only does God create and sustain everything, but we're also told that he directs everything toward their appointed end.
Ooh,
God is not
that's really
only the
good, Ken.
creator, he's not only the creator, the designer, but he is the one that has appointed all of these things toward their ultimate end. And so again, we believe that God is able to work all things together for good. God is able to meet our needs because everything comes out of the blueprint of his mind.
So interesting. Ken Samples is my guest. We're talking about God and creation. I had a question pop up. Ken, what about the firmament and the earth being flat, which was the belief throughout the Bible?
Well, there again, one of the questions that comes up again and again is how was the biblical creation view both like and unlike the ancient Near Eastern views? And so I think it is possible to recognize that Moses is writing the book of Genesis. And he is speaking in such a way, he wants his audience to understand him. But there are things that are similar there, but there are also these very different kind of elements. And one of the points I like to make is sometimes modern people think that they're a whole lot smarter than people who lived in, the ancient world. Actually, the book of Genesis is a very sophisticated presentation. Now, it's not a scientific textbook per se, but the kinds of things in which it describes is, I think, quite consistent with the way scientists, think about physics and the origin of the universe itself.
Well, being all scripture is inspired by God, I can understand why it was such an awesome book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's right. It is the spirit supervised. It is the spirit created. There's another type of creation. We get the word of God, and the Holy Spirit is it. He's using Paul's mindset and education and cultural understanding and Moses and Isaiah, but the final product is this divinely inspired, completely without error book. And think of the influence of the Bible. It's hard to conceive of the kind of influence this book, this Jewish and then Christian book, have had upon the world.
Mm-hmm. Ken Samples is my guest. He is a senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe. You can go to reasons.org to learn more about him. When I come back, I want to ask him about the doctrine of creation, what that reveals about God's nature. If you have a question or comment for Ken, you can text it over to me, 877-933-2484.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
I always like talking to people that are way, way smarter than me. And my guest, Ken Samples, is that. So we're talking today about God's creation and God's relationship to creation. And Ken, I'd love for you to talk about how does the doctrine of creation, and what does it reveal about God's nature?
And this is really the point I think we ought to give careful consideration, Bill, because this creation is pointing to a God that did all of these incredible things. And therefore, as we begin to think about theology, God has all these attributes. I call them the omni attributes. He's all powerful. He's everywhere present. He has all knowledge. If God created everything out of non-existence, creation ex nihilo, we know that he is outside of time and space. He's transcendent. We also know that he doesn't have a physical body. He is immaterial. He is a spiritual being. And we know that God is uncaused. He is not a contingent or dependent creature. He's a necessary being. His being is the ground or the foundation for the fact that all other things exist and came into existence. And this theology, and again, it's unique. The gods of the Egyptians, the Indians, the Chinese were very different than this presentation. But theology then should lead us to doxology. Theology, theos, God, the study of God, theology, doxology. Doxos has to do with worship. Doxology. There have been skeptics who have come along and said, man, what's the deal with the biblical God? I think of Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, who says God is egotistical, he's jealous, he's petty. Why does he go around demanding that Israel worship him? And my response to that, Bill, is if you knew a being that was perfectly holy, perfectly righteous, perfectly loving, knew all things, was everywhere present, possessed all power, we're talking about a perfect being, I think you would need to worship a God that is truth, goodness, and beauty. And so this idea, this should all lead us to have confidence. And again, I love philosophy and theology. I love studying all these things, but I've also had some suffering in my life. And I realized that my theology really needs to inform my day-to-day life. And that leads to worship. We're called to worship the Lord. to thank him, to be grateful to him. And so again, we have Thanksgiving coming up. Well, it's not just that God has provided us with a home and work. He created all things and he sustains us moment by moment in existence. And so God sees it as perfectly appropriate that his creatures worship him, that they hold him above all other things. We're not to put anything in front of God. We're not to create, an image of God. This is what stands behind the Ten Commandments, our devotion to the Lord. I think that this is such an important area. And I think that having good theology, having an understanding of God's work in creation can really help us to realize, hey, I want to worship the Lord. I want to sing those songs. I want to talk about his glory. So I think the doctrine of creation is just an amazing doctrine, and it has so many practical implications.
Yeah. And I'm enthusiastic about everything you just said. That was awesome. All right, let's go to just the fact that we are created in the image of God. When it gets down to God and creation, the Imago Dei, what does it specifically mean for humanity to be made in the image of God? This is a big one, Ken.
It is a big one. There's only about a half a dozen verses that specifically speak of humans being made in the image of God, but it's not the number that makes it so important. It is the fact that God has somehow made us in his image. Now, again, there are areas where Christians disagree about these kinds of things, about creation. Christians are not in complete agreement as to exactly what it means to be made in the image of God. It's kind of three major views. I call them the three R's. One is we resemble God. That means that even though we're finite, and even though we are now fallen after Adam and Eve's rebellion, we still resemble God. We're rational creatures. We're moral creatures. We're spiritual creatures. And in our finite way, we reflect that. We resemble God. Another view that's probably even more popular now is called the relational view. That is, we're like God and like the Trinity in that we can relate person to person. We're created male and female, and our capacity to have this social interaction, maybe that reflects the image of God. Another one that is solidly biblical is that we represent God. We're his vice regents. We take dominion over nature. Adam was naming the animals. We do things for God. And so resemblance, relational, representative. And again, what is so important in terms of implication, Bill, is it's the image of God that really stamped out slavery. It's when people began to say, hey, wait a second here. All people are made in the image of God, regardless of their skin color. They're made in the image of God. And so the abolition movement, both in England, in Europe, and in America, was driven by this idea that all people bear the image of God. And so people have inherent dignity and moral worth. And I talk to atheists and agnostics, and they say, well, I don't believe God existed. And I say, well, what's your argument against slavery then? This is very important to say that human beings have a divine spark is a uniqueness, the exceptional human beings. And one of my favorite philosophers and scientists, Pascal, says, we're great and wretched. We're great because of the image of God. We're wretched because of the fall. And so the Bible seems to describe well human beings. They have inherent dignity. They have exceptional qualities, but you can't trust them. I mean, think about the 20th century. Think about how many people were exterminated by some of these leading countries of the world. We realize that human beings are both great and wretched.
Ken, what do you mean by divine spark? I'd love to hear that defined by you.
Yeah, here I'm going to take you back to, again, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And what we recognize that in that chapter, verse 7, it says that God created human beings from the dust of the ground. I think it's verse 19 of that same chapter says that God created the animals from the dust of the ground. And what I interpret that is we shouldn't be surprised that there are certain qualities that animals have that we have. But we should see something different because humans have the breath of life. They have what I would tie to Genesis 1:26 through 28, the image of God. And so it is that imago Dei, it's that image of God that makes us different. That's what some people have referenced as the spark of the divine. We have something the animals don't, and we should take care of the animals because we're the caretakers of the planet. We have that responsibility to treat animals in a way that they can't treat us because they are amazing and wonderful and remarkable, and we couldn't exist without them. But they're not made in the image of God, thus the unique dignity of human beings.
I really appreciate that explanation. That was incredibly helpful. We're going to take a little break and come right back with more with Ken Samples. Ken's a philosopher and theologian. You can learn more about him at reasons.org as we continue our discussion on God and creation. What's God's relationship to creation? Everything. Be right back.
Psst, have you heard the news? Listening just got better with the new and improved Faith Radio app. No more restrictions, no more static, no more missing your favorite shows. Now, listen when you want, where you want, and share with everyone. When you need hope, encouragement, Jesus, it's right there on your phone. Text the word app to 877-933-2484 and follow the link or search Faith Radio Network in your app store.
I'm back with Ken Samples. We're talking about God's creation today, and what an awesome God that created everything out of nothing. And this is a discussion that if you've had before with friends, they say, well, how did that happen? And how does God create something out of nothing? Because we're stuck in this. We need materials to make something, to create something. We're stuck in this human context where we can only create what we have available to us, and God created everything out of nothing. So as we talk about being created in the image of God, that's one thing we say, or I say often, that you are an image bearer of God. And I appreciate, Ken, everything you said about what it means for humanity to be made in the image of God. But maybe you would talk about now about the moral implications of bearing that divine image, because we are image bearers. So what comes with that?
Yeah, and this is so important today that from the moment of our conception till the moment of our death, we bear the image of God. We have this dignity. We have this value. It's the Creator that brought us into existence. And because we are like the Lord, we are to be treated in a particular way. And of course, what we realize, and this is, I think, a very powerful point, Bill, that the Bible gets it right. Humans are special and they're miserable all at the same time. We have so many wonderful qualities, rationality, morality, but when they're twisted, when they're curved in back toward ourselves, then we have the capacity to see things like rape and robbery and racism and genocide. So what comes out of this is, again, the sheer dignity of human beings. If there's no God and evolution has somehow coughed us up, then we don't have any inherent dignity and moral worth. We have no ultimate meaning and purpose in life. If you take away the God of creation, pretty soon human beings will lose all of that dignity. And I think that that's what we've been seeing for a long time. For the last 150 years, I think we began to see it in the 1960s, where people thought, well, we don't have to keep these sexual norms. We can change all of that, to a place now where marriage is redefined. Now we're at a place where women and men are redefined. I think that moral implication is so critical as a part of that. And the famous atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, he was right. If God is dead, man is dead. C.S. Lewis talked about the abolition of man. If we lose God and lose objective morality, then man is dead. And I think that is such a powerful point. The Bible gets so much of this right on target. And so the dignity of human beings, there has to be a value beyond the physical body here on earth. There has to be a ground, a foundation. And again, you cannot stop believing in the God of the Bible and retain all the benefits that come from it, like meaning and purpose and rationality and science. As the skeptical historian Tom Holland said, everybody in the West swim in Christian waters. We are the product of a historic Christian perspective. Bill, a few centuries ago, we didn't talk about Western civilization. We called it Christendom.
Yes, that's true.
So this is very critical. You lose the God, you lose man.
That's such an excellent point, Ken. Thank you for reminding me of that. Probably reminding a lot of people of that. All right, we just have a couple of minutes left as we talk about God's relationship to creation. What response do you think Christians should have to the reality of God's creation? Well, it's kind of a big question, but you're the man for the job.
Yeah, and again, here I'm gonna kind of bring us back to some of the points that we've made. I think there's two words, and they both start with W: wonder and worship. Wonder and worship. This God that we have described, that has all power, is perfectly holy, perfectly loving, who is transcendent, who has no cause. This is a being that we should wonder about. We should reflect upon and think about and recognize all of the things that God has done for us in our life. And that sense of wonder, I think of the famous Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas. When he was 5 years old, he asked the priest, "What is God?" Well, that's the question that I think this should bring us to. What kind of being is God that he could do all of this? And then that first W of wonder should lead again to worship. Just telling God, we owe you all things. It is not right for us to have our own life independent of the Lord. These are the things that Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount, that we should have such devotion for God, that everything should be in contrast to that. And of course, it's the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, he is the creator. Colossians 1:16, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and that Word is the one who brought forth the universe. And then that Word became flesh. We think about Christmas. These are remarkable things. Christians hold remarkable beliefs. Nothing in fiction can compare to these ideas. I mean, yeah, in the 20th century, a man walked on the moon, but in the first century, God walked on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
These are remarkable things. Wonder and worship.
Yeah, and if you observe nature and it leads you to worship, that's a good thing.
Yeah, look
Yeah.
at the beauty, look at its power, and think of the God behind it
Yeah,
all.
it's
Wow.
fantastic. Ken, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. It's always a delight. I learn so much when you come on. I appreciate you very much.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Ken Samples has been my guest. You can learn more about Ken at reasons.org. That's the show we have for today. I hope you had a wonderful day and a blessing on your evening tonight. And I pray that you rest well. We've got a busy week ahead of us here, and I hope that you stay prayerful and vigilant. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.